Hello, and welcome to Coffee Time. Coffee Time is a space where magical humans come together for some real talk, strong coffee, and powerful introspections on whatever is top of mind right now. My name is Natalie, and I am your host for this channel and today's super exciting conversation. The idea behind Coffee Time is that you are in your favorite coffee shop, maybe cozied up with a book, and you begin to listen in on an intriguing conversation between folks at the next table over. For that reason, there is no big introduction. We absolutely let the conversation speak for itself, and if you do want to know more about these special guests following today's episode, I invite you to check out the show notes for more details. So on that note, let's dive right in.
You mentioned the card pulls.
Yep.
And I know when we were talking, maybe 6-8 weeks ago, you're like, so I got this message about the card pulls essentially, and you needing to, this is what you need to do right now. Mm-hmm. Where did that come from, you think?
Well, it's funny because I got the other message the other day. So I think it was just in terms of that next level of trust with my abilities. And that's what a lot of this has been, like the spirits in my house, the things that come up on my path, the conversations that I'm engaging in. A lot of it has to do with, this is the next thing you need to trust yourself as you move forward. And so that was like, do a reading for another person. And then it was like, charge for your readings because believe that you deserve that. And even doing that, oh my Lord, it was difficult because I see the readings I give and then I see readings other people online are doing and they're very different. And not in terms of the messages, but in terms of like the types of information. Like some people I think just connect really well to like past life information. I'm not one of those people, at least not at this point, or it just comes through differently and I'm learning how to interpret it. Like, I don't know. So there was a lot of judgment on me even through that. And through doing these readings I did recently, like for the $5 giveaway thingy-majig, it took a couple for me to really get to the point of being like, no, like I'm doing it and like show up for it. And I think that was it. I also got a message though, that like, I'm not meant to be a business person. Like that's not me in this. And so, yeah, it's reasonable that I would be to an extent compensated for my efforts. But I'm not looking to become like a professional reader or whatever. But how that message came through, well, I've had it in my records before where it was a more explicit message of like, this is what you need to do to trust yourself. Like, this is the next thing for right now. And that's why they said to start offering records readings to people. And I did, and I've done a bunch. I tried to do a live one once and was like, that's not for me. I'm going to stick to writing because that's what works. It's how I engage better. But now it was more like a clairsentience, like a feeling of just, you need to push to do this thing. You need to push your comfort zone a little bit. It doesn't mean that's where you're going to stay. It's just to show yourself you can do it and be okay and you're worthy and then figure out what's right for you.
Yeah. That's part of the journey thing that we were just talking about. The next step. So like your next step doesn't have to be like, cool, like card pulls for 1 year. It could be literally like, I did that for a day, done.
Yep.
I trust myself and we're moving on.
Well, yeah, and like now it's out there. Like people know. Like I actually had someone recently start a Facebook group and they're doing something like I do in Soulscape with the Humble Brag, where they're doing posts about people's businesses. And they're like, oh, are you still doing this? I was like, yeah, I guess I offer these things. And they're like, okay, cool. So they posted it. And then someone reached out being like, hey, I want a records reading. And I was like, cool. But I also said to them, I was like, I'm healing from surgery. I'm behind. I'll get this to you by the new year. It's like 2.5 weeks. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. Awesome. So it'll come up as it needs to. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
So in general, is there a certain time you receive messages? Like when do they come through? Are there moments? Is there intention behind you seeking an answer or a message? How does that come through to you?
So are we talking like just in general information, or like, are you talking like when I go into my records, or all of it?
I would say in general information, and then maybe when you go into, like, is it a different look if you go into your records?
Information comes through always. It doesn't really stop. A lot of the time it's in conversation with someone. I'll just get a feeling about something and I'll share it. And I'm starting to kind of trust when that needs to be shared a bit more. And sometimes it's just I'm walking through my house and all of a sudden there's this thought and I was like, where the fuck did you come from? And that's, I'm like, all right, something's going on. So that's kind of what it looks like now, but it does happen a lot in interaction. And like, that makes sense to me because, so I, at the beginning, talked about like theory of a higher power, and this actually kind of loops back because for a very long time, and like when I got sober, it's like you meditate and you ask for answers and like God gives you a thing or like higher power gives you a thing or whatever. And I was like, I think I was channeling. Like that's what that was. And now that we're talking about this and I say it happens in conversation, my theory of a higher power was formulated from this book called I and Thou by, I think it's Martin Buber, who's a Jewish philosopher. He talks about the fact, that people are necessary. We are necessary for God's existence because we create the space in which God manifests. So it's like you and me talking and there's this space between, and that is where God manifests, and that is where meaning is created. And like my high school philosophy teacher did her master's in philosophy of education and talked about like Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. And it's like, if you've heard of that, it's like the person's in a room and they're given a sheet of like, in the thought experiment, they say Chinese characters, and then a page that's a map. And it's like, this character means this thing. And so they take that and they figure out what the phrasing is and they write it down. And the question is, did they learn? If they give this back to the person to get out of this room, did they learn? And her argument, and similar to what comes up with this theory of a higher power, is it's not about the material in front of you. It's about how you engage with it. It's that between space is where learning happens, right? It's between teacher and student where learning happens. And I guess it's when I'm talking to a person or when I'm sitting with a tree and I'm fully present, that space between is where that channeling kind of occurs and it opens up that possibility. I don't know where I was going with this, but apparently it needed to be said. So anyway, I think that's God to me. And I think it always had been, and I just didn't realize that that's what was going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what I was talking about, but so it's very fluid, I guess is what I was getting at. And I think that's the thing is like, if I can just be present moment to moment, it happens moment to moment. Like it doesn't shut down. And there's the times like when I go on my records where it's a little more like intentionally tuning into it. So that's where I'm not going to be walking down the street listening to music or a podcast or whatever and simultaneously be having a conversation with a spirit that's connecting to me. But I could be walking down the street, think a thing, have a thought and be like, oh, or have something happen and be like, oh, I want to talk to my spirit, like the spirit that I work with, and take pause to tune in more. And I think the records is a more intentional way of holding that space where that channeling occurs, is how I see it. Yeah.
So it's more intentional versus
accidental. More intentional. And I think because I'm showing up in this container, right, this structured container, I am opening up to more abundant messages versus like it's happening while I'm doing a thing and like blah, blah, blah. But the same thing could happen if I'm just sitting on my couch. Like I think I told you about that one time where I first channeled in writing and I was sitting on my couch and my hand just started shaking and I was like, I think I'm supposed to write something. So I picked up the pen and I wrote like 2 pages. But the thing is, I wouldn't have got that big message unless I picked up the pen and turned off the TV to write those 2 pages. And like in that moment, that was the equivalent of going into my records to get a more thorough message.
Right.
Yeah.
And recognizing, oh, my hand is shaking. I should do something about that. And trusting that. Because that you might just be like, cool, my hand's shaking. Anyway. Like,
well, yeah, I have MS. Like there's a lot of reasons that could have been happening. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about messages that you get just in general, messages that you get through the records more intentionally. Have you ever been poked? So you mentioned like Taylor and wanting to go into like the Together records. But have you ever been randomly poked, like if you're like walking down the street with somebody else coming through, or somebody else's message, or like you talked about the gentleman that followed you home from the hospital? Like, have you ever just randomly been like, this isn't for me?
You know what? In a slightly different way, I think the beginning of that happened with the breakup, because the weekend that we broke up, and like before it actually happened, I was in Whistler. I was at the lodge where we got engaged on the weekend we were originally supposed to get married. The weekend that we broke up. Yeah.
So bizarre.
The universe was like, you can handle it. Go. So, but I remember being so anxious, and we'd had a phone call and we'd been talking about things and things were seeming good. And I was so anxious and unsettled, and that's not normal for me. Like, I can normally be pretty objective about it and be like, okay, anxiety's coming up, but like, here's what you really know. This is all you can infer at this point. So like, let it go until you talk. You can't know until you talk, right? But I was spiraling. Like, it was really weird. And it was on like the Sunday that we broke up. And then I did a meditation thing that I recommend to people all the time. And it's Lynn Ames, like Clearing, Grounding, Protecting. I really like it. It's like 12 minutes long, super easy. And all that stuff went away. And it was that thought of like, oh, that wasn't mine. Like, I was feeling his stuff. And I think that was the first glimpse at feeling things for another person. Now, that was more on like the empath realm of it, right? But that was like the first way that it came up for me. And then how has it come up since then? Because it does happen, but it normally happens when I'm like talking to you. So like if we were having a conversation, whatever, and then all of a sudden I get this thing and I'm like, oh, okay, I think I need to tell that to you. It won't normally happen with like random people.
Okay.
I more have the like empathic synchronicities come up. That's a strong one. So like even the person that I'm now talking to, it was like a Tuesday morning and we'd had comments in a group for like the third time. And I was like, how do I figure out how to DM this person? And literally seconds later, they were like, is it cool if I DM you? We keep crossing paths. And I was like, sure. Like that kind of thing. Or like, I feel like there's been many other examples, but that's more the kind of synchronicity that I get a lot. Or like I had 4 people within a week where I thought of them or thought of messaging them, and they messaged me within like an hour. And this includes a friend who I hadn't talked to in 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So just like things like that happen more so. But the messages are more when I'm engaging with a person, it'll come through, and I'm getting better at just saying it. People tell me to just say it, like as part of conversation. I don't, because often these messages can really, I find at least, come across as like discounting the other person's experience. And I don't really want to like intentionally be like spiritual bypassing. Like if your friend's going through something really difficult, you don't want to be like, it's all for your highest good. I had people say that to me going through the breakup, and like, I now know that is true, but in that moment, saying that doesn't feel better. So people know me well enough now that I feel like I can say like, hey, this is what's coming up. I'm going to share it with you. It feels a little bit jarring, but like take it with a grain of salt. I just want you to have the information. And that's kind of what I'll do. Or like people really close to me know when it doesn't sound like me. So it can be a bit more okay. But I think personally it's important to give it that context.
Do you ever not give the message? Do you ever decide for yourself, I don't want to do this?
No, I think that I give it because you know what? I did a card pull for this person I've been talking about, like when we first started talking, and it was like a pretty intense message. And I think in 3 different points in my text, I was like, this isn't me. Like, they told me I have to trust and give this to you. I'm sorry, it's weird. And now it's like 3 months later, and I kind of talked about it the other day, and they were like, yeah, that was a lot. I was like, it's not my fault. Like, you said yes to a card pull. That's what they told me. I had no choice but to tell you. So I don't hold back. And in that moment too, that was an important point of like, you need to trust. One, I think that this person can handle this message, and two, that like trusting my connection, but also I think it's that degree of like, I don't know if it's like humility, but recognizing that like, it isn't me. So like, I don't get to judge what's coming through because it's not mine. Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't get to say, "Ooh, I'm not going to say this." It's obviously meant to be given. If that's the message,
I'm opening up to it, it's there. Yeah.
I definitely want a card pull. This is exciting stuff.
You want one?
Yeah, I'm like,
I can do one for you. Yeah.
That's speaking of breakup and moving on into new things and finding yourself and recognizing yourself in new ways, new communities, all of that stuff. How have you made sense of those journeys? Like you mentioned before, the spiritual stuff, there's like you were getting into the kink stuff, right? Or that was coming up then, and just different parts of like relationship. How have you connected that with your spiritual side and have explicit messages come through for you as it relates to partnership or those supports that surround you? Or non-supports, actually. That could be one thing.
Yeah, well, I think that a big theme across both is that recognition that like shadow is not. So there's this thing where people are like, you need to bring your light into the shadows, and it's like, but light is the reason that shadows exist. So the more you turn up the light, the darker the shadows will get. And I think it's really more about like being able to go into the shadows because we know we have the light within us. So like, I don't need to fear the darkness. I don't need to fear the shadow. And further from that, it's recognizing that that shadow is me just as much as the light is. It's not meant to be like fixed or anything, like it just is. And that is where the kink and like existential kink comes into play, because it really is like acknowledging that shadow and acknowledging what we get from living in that shadow, and the turn on that exists in that shadow. And it's similar, like if I think about it, to like looking into the dark corner of my room trying to figure out what's there. There's a curiosity, there's an intrigue, right? There might also be that fear and apprehension, but there's desire to know and explore. Yet we label things that are dark inherently as like bad, right? Like lower vibrational entities are bad because they're lower vibration. And we put this like moral judgment on energy when it's like, what? Like energy is everything. Like energy is neutral. It's not meant to be evaluated that way. And so why is my existence meant to be lived that way? It's not. And so I think it's really been in all of that about stepping into that new level of acceptance around how things just are. And then further from that acceptance, it's about like embracing how they coexist and like celebrating that coexistence in myself compared to the world around me, and also just like on the spiritual plane.
So interesting what you said about shadow and actually like embracing the shadow, when a lot of times you're taught to either shut it out, fix it, whatever, not supposed to be there. Don't touch it.
Like, that's, well, if we're talking less existential kink in terms of like, you know, so how do I explain? Like for me, a big one was about that I was working through recently was about like my addiction stuff. And I was doing some work around it before going into surgery because I really didn't want painkillers. And I was like, why am I so adamant to hang on to this facet of my, like, I called it addict persona? Like, why do I need to hang on to that? I can't have any painkillers because that's where my addiction started, blah, that I would be willing to like put myself in harm of not accepting medical treatment. Like, what is going on here? And what I just realized was like, I want to be unique. I want to be seen as important. Like, I like the attention that I get from that. And it's not to say I'm doing it consciously to get those things like that. And there might be a reason I still choose to refuse them. And I did choose to refuse them, but I needed to work through that thing first. And it's like, why is it so bad to want attention and want to be important? It's not. It's not. I'm allowed to want that and get excited by it. And so when I could do that, it kind of shifted. And then, but if you bring that into like more physical kink scenarios, it's exactly what you're talking about. Like the whole world of kink is anything that is other. And so like for someone who's like super strict religious, like super strict, like kissing someone before marriage could be kink to them, right? And then you get to people who are more into like BDSM or like whatever that looks like, or, you know, I made a joke at Christmas yesterday about knife play, which was really funny. And that's kink. It's other. And sometimes the turn on is from the fact that it's other, right? And like, that is not wrong. Safety, consent, conversation, all is like an assumed thing here. But it's not wrong to be turned on by the thing that is othered by the people around you. And that goes for shadow self too. That goes for exploring those dark corners of your bedroom to see what's there. It's okay to be curious about the darkness. And like, it's okay to want to sit there too.
I mean, there's such a connection to also then embracing things, embracing the unknown too, about like, okay, it's okay to wonder what this is, why I'm getting this, why I'm being pulled here. It's okay to wonder, not shut shit out just because it seems off the beaten path of somebody else or the norm of society, right? Like we were just talking about, how do you feel so comfortable talking about all this stuff? People think it's wacko. People think it's crazy. Like, what are the records? Like, what? So like, there's like such a connection to that. And it's, again, really interesting that it's all happening within this space and time. That there's the, okay, I'm going to acknowledge it and I'm going to try and embrace it, whatever that might be.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting to think about how it all connects. And like, I'm thinking about a conversation I had recently too with a former partner of mine. We were just catching up and I mentioned like the ghosts and things. And I was expecting this person to be like, huh? And I kind of felt like I was getting that look. And then all of a sudden they just say to me, they're like, well, you know, they can't hurt you. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you just need to acknowledge that they exist. And if you want them to go, you ask and they will. And I was like, where is this coming from? And they mentioned it was a spiritual teaching in the faith that I'm exploring currently. And I was like, okay, well, there's another point in that direction. But I just thought that was so fascinating. And, you know, that's the other thing with being so open about it. That is really amazing, is that as much as I am being vulnerable and putting myself out there, and definitely I will say sometimes I am so forward about it because it's easier to other myself first. And so not all of it is coming from a place of self-acceptance. And I will be transparent about that. I am still figuring this out. And being open about it means that I more quickly get to learn about those parts of other people that they're secretive about and they're scared of, because I've now created a place they feel safe exploring those shadows for themselves, right? Like if I can live in mine, you can bring yours forward for a couple of minutes when we talk. And so I get to know people in a very different way.
Do you think it's, because I've noticed this myself over probably like the last 2 years or so, just the connection with people that are discovering these new sides of themselves and how literally like casual that conversation is. Whereas previously it would have been like, hey, like there's like this
thing.
There's like this thing, you know? And so like, I just feel like people are like openly talking about it. Things are becoming more normalized in some ways. Even honestly monetized. In some ways, like you think about like the meditation movements, or like even like yoga was a spiritual practice. It has now become this big giant machine, essentially, right? Like things are being like brought to the surface that everybody's like, okay, we could talk about this without fear of judgment. And I'm just like, is this like the coming of like this massive sweeping change that is like, I don't know, it's like people are more exploratory. People are more open.
Yeah. I feel, let me sit with it for a sec. I feel like there's different reasons. One, COVID. We're all home. So there's a lot of these things that I think we've all been thinking about that maybe didn't come up in a casual conversation at a coffee shop that we can maybe almost more easily explore in the virtual world connecting. And I think then there's also that added aspect of virtual connection, social media, where we have a buffer. Like, it's not like I'm in your face out in public talking about this stuff. Like, I could delete my account at any time and like start over. So there's that aspect, I think, that creates a bit of distance from it that allows us to share more, if that makes sense. And I think those things together with like the current state of affairs in the world just have meant that more of us have opened up. But then I'm like, a lot of the things we're all talking about, if it really does link to like past life, whatever, and like Akashic Records didn't start now, like they've been around in different traditions for generations and centuries. So these things were happening already, right? It's just that I almost want to say, like, because of social media, we now have more direct access to the communities around it. Whereas before, I have to wonder, and this is just speculation, like this is not me knowing anything about this, but I have to wonder if like there was less access even to like what would be considered open practices in magic because we didn't have phones and internet and things to connect us to it. So everything became more closed in a way, right? Like the communities were more protected. Like, this is just me pondering as we talk. On an individual level, that's tricky. Like, I know a lot of us have received messages, I think, this year, and I am not one to get into these kinds of conversations, so like take it with a grain of salt, that like the world is up leveling. Like, I think even when we were in our session together, there was that message that like the world is currently going through cycles that would normally take decades or centuries to go through, and it's happening in weeks. And I think I don't love that message as the forefront of the message, because it detracts from the individual lived experiences that are happening and the the marginalization and the harm that is being done to people throughout everything that is going on in this world right now. And I also see where that sentiment mirrors what I have personally experienced in terms of the spiritual development over this time. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's some truth to it. I don't think that should be the focus of everything right now. I think we can know that that is happening while we focus the other stuff, right? But I think that's it. And I think that the more you tap into it and the more like I open up to the possibility of it, the more I see it. It's kind of like that. If you want to see a sign, you'll see one, and like people, this gets me on another topic. People with this whole like angel numbers bullshit. It's not bullshit, but like, yeah, you check your phone enough, you're going to see 555 every day. I'm sorry. So like, is it spirituality or is it a dependence on technology? You tell me.
I mean, this is like a math equation, actually. Like probability.
Thank you. I studied probability theory. Exactly. And I've got to the point now where instead of tapping my phones, like I'll tap a piece of paper thinking it'll get it to respond to me. So like chances are me seeing 555 daily has more to do with the fact that I am on my phone 24/7. I get off work at the same time every day. I have pretty much the same schedule every day. So I'm checking my phone at that time. Like, I can be curious and look into what the number means, but like, I'm kind of the same with like this whole Saturn return. Is that what it's called? Like, technically I'm in mine. Technically, yes, my whole life has shifted and all this stuff has happened and whatever. If I weren't as spiritually attuned, it probably would have been a more giant, prolonged clusterfuck than it has been. But also, life just happens whether you read your natal chart or not. So, like, live it. And that, I think, is really how I feel about this. Like, I think there's all these factors that come into play of like why we're opening up and why we're having the conversations more easily. But at the end of the day, it's like, if I want to find the place to have the conversation, I'm going to find it. When I was drinking, if I really wanted to stop drinking, I was going to find a community that supported me to do that, whether I knew it existed or not. And at the time, I did not. I somehow just found it. So I think there's a bit of both.
It's very chicken and eggy
Mm-hmm.
in a weird way.
Should ask my records which came first.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I think that like there is some, do you think that like there like a collective acknowledgement of a thing, like you just mentioned Saturn or like, you know, Age of Aquarius and all of these things, like a collective acknowledgement of that
I just
thing?
think of that song and then
Yeah.
you start laughing. Sorry. And I have like an inside joke about Aquarius with someone. So like as soon as anyone says Aquarius, I'm like, Aquarians. Like it's like a thing. But sorry.
I'm Aquarius. I have two Aquarius, Sun and.
Are you really?
Yeah. Shocking. I'm January.
Really funny. It's really funny.
January.
After we're done this, I'll voice memo you about the Aquarius thing. I'm not putting that out there, but sorry, continue the collective awareness thing, right?
Yeah. A collective acknowledgement of the shift. Do you think that's like a something that like something that is meant to come in this moment? It's like the collective acknowledgement that we are all living in a global pandemic. It is a great not, I won't say equalizer, but it is a global pandemic. There are people experiencing this thing very different. It is not equal, but it is happening, right, to the great majority of people on this planet currently. And do you think a collective acknowledgement of a shift or a change, or that there's something bigger, greater, wider than the self is, I don't want to say an achievement, but something that is meant to happen right now? Just like we said, like the you know, there's a conscious up leveling going on. Like, is that like part of this, like why we're all here, why we're connecting right now, in fact, talking about these things?
See, this is where I feel my own resistance. Like I'm very resistant to like it's meant to happen. Like I do think that there's likely something to be said for if we brought this back, and like I haven't studied this thoroughly, but like to like quantum theory kind of thing, where like this many people consciously focusing on a thing and being aware of it is going to shift the state of affairs drastically, like on an energetic level, on a molecular level. Scientifically, it's been shown. Could I tell you about that science? No. But like, I do believe there's something to be said for that. But then at the same time, you say like, are we meant to do this? And I was like, well, not everyone is. Like, there's also that group of people who very much is denying everything that is going on right now in this world. Let me think. But then it's like, because earlier I talked about, you know, the community of people with these individualized experiences being the act of rebellion against the oppressor. And I start to think, could our community of people acknowledging this common, like you said, not the same, but common context, we'll say, maybe, I don't know, would that have as much value or as much impact if the group of people who don't believe it and who question everything or choose ignorance didn't exist? Because like that's the oppressor in that generalized experience, right? And so I'm sorry, I move slow sometimes. I know my brain can go really fast, but there's so many pieces that sometimes I just have to like pause and sit with it for a second. I feel like it's that polarization that's meant to happen. And I don't want to say it's meant to happen as like I never want to say that as a way to like discount what's going on. Yep. That's where I get really stuck on those meant to happen things, I think, because like no one is meant to be harmed. No one is meant to have like whatever. But I think that polarization is, let's put it this way. When I say meant to, I think that polarization is necessary to show just how important this community we're stepping into is. And as, yeah, that's it. And as an extra push for those of us on the cusp to step into it, to get open, to move forward, and to open up about things that we never thought we could. Jesus Christ, I have chills. Sorry, it's like energetically a lot right now. Because we know, maybe not us as individuals, but like we need that healing that comes from that. We deserve that healing that comes from that. And I think, I think that's kind of what it is.
I mean, you mentioned like nobody's meant to be harmed.
Mm.
Right? And we've also learned that about soul contracts and things that are, you like the journey through your life, Earthside, or lives, Earthside, and how very different they are. And it's almost like you've chosen a lot of this before you've actually made your way here. Or are there lessons to be learned that, you might be experiencing certain experiences in your life that others don't, or polarization or marginalization, like all of those things, like that's what like can sometimes be really difficult. Or loss. We started this conversation about like you going through loss and what that meant and things like that. And how does that come in?
So my experience with that, I was shone more light was shone on it in another reading that I had, actually the one that was like burn everything down, that's the message I got from it. And what it came was actually that I think she was one of my guides who incarnated, and her leaving was the last part of our contract.
Wow.
So when I understood it that way, it made more sense, because also knowing about like master's guides, beings of light, you would understand that a guide choosing to incarnate is very different than how I would take like a regular soul being born into an incarnation and living a life. Like very much she was coming here with an intention to meet me, to serve this purpose, and to give me that experience. And so I see that very different than like harm, right? The other thing is like people say, if we take the like broad spiritual aspect out of this, people will often say like, there's a lesson to be learned in anything, or like it happened for a reason, but we give things that reason, right? Like I can learn that lesson at any point in time. And so if we're talking, and I don't know a ton about soul contracts, like I actually have my friend Lauren, I'm going to have her on here eventually to talk strictly about that, because she's really great at explaining it. And the way she does her readings, I feel she touches on it a lot. It's just something she's like attuned to, I think. I less so, because I don't look for concrete answers. But I think that it's one of those things where there's a contract, but I don't think, personally at least at this point in time, I don't think that every single detail of our existence is mapped out before we get here. I think there's themes, right? I think there's lessons we're meant to learn. But whether I learn the lesson from stubbing my toe on a block of ice one day, or I learn it from getting on it in like a head-on car crash and like surviving, that's up to me. Like that has to do
with some level of free will.
Yeah, I think free will and like the interfacing between the soul and the corporeal experience, right? Because like we attune to that in different ways at different times. And perspective is key. So I don't think that, I don't want to say harm is relative. That's not really what I mean. But if we're talking about, like you said, like someone's contract might be that they need to experience harm to learn the thing, or someone needs to cause harm to learn the thing. The degree to which that must happen, I think, is not set in stone.
That's not determined.
Does that make sense a bit?
Yeah.
Yes. It's a tricky thing to put into words. I'm trying to be cautious of how I say it, but I think that's what I'm kind of trying to get at.
Yes. I think the stubbing of the toe versus, something more quote unquote serious.
Yeah.
That brings it to life.
I'm just going to say the stubbing of the toe was legit. Like I was outside of a hockey rink once and I kicked ice that was on the ground thinking it would move and it did not move and it really hurt.
Lesson learned. Did you break your toe?
No, I thought I did. I broke my toe another time though. Well, I didn't break it. I dislocated it. But I was definitely the kid who like put my hands on the fireplace and then like later on in life went to do it again. Like, is it still hot? I don't know. Like, fuck. So that's me.
You should examine that. You should totally examine that.
Oh, I mean, I don't learn the easy way. Like, it's a thing. I mean, that's why it took me 3 decades to finally be like, okay, it's happening. Like, I'm here. And even still, I fight. I fight all the time. So.
It's really funny though, because it's like, yeah, it took 3 decades for you to get there, but like it smacked you in the face. Like, I feel like it smacked you in the face more so than maybe a lot of people, right? Like, you know, I could say like my own journey and path into like the spiritual side of myself was very slow. And a lot of it was intentional. I mean, you know, I want to learn this side of myself or whatever, but it was slow. I'm still there. I'm still learning. I turn it off and flip it on all the time, right? But you, just like we talked about initially, like it like hit you over the head.
Yeah.
And the messages that you receive, and like, I think actually one of the questions that we got for this from the community is like, speaking of physical, hitting somebody over the head, but like, what do you actually experience physically from the messages, or you tapping into your records, or when you receive them, whatever it is? Like, what are some of the side effects?
So, yeah, I remember why that question came up actually. So I, at a certain point after the breakup, when a lot of these, so the breakup was really like breakup, uncoupling, whatever you want to say. I taught my niece the word uncoupling and it's really cute because now she knows not to say divorce or breakup. She's like, what was the coupling thing? I was like, oh, the uncoupling. She's like, yeah. Can you explain that again? I was like, okay. And like, so now she knows. It's like this 7-year-old kid and she understands that an uncoupling is what happens when people have work they need to do as individuals and maybe one of them is sad or something's gone on and they need time by themselves to do that work. So now she knows that.
Coupling, great.
Super cute. But so what was happening at that point, and I think it was like not a turning point, but like a fulcrum, would that be a right word maybe? For all this stuff to kind of start coming together. And I went through like 3 weeks of just like burning in my head. Like my crown was on fire. And this was something that came up in one of the little tangent groups we did for Soulscape. And I was like, yeah, because it's open and I can't close it. And my friend was like, aren't your chakras always supposed to be open? And I think it's a semantics thing. I would argue that they're always active and like energy is always circulating through your body. But in terms of like entity work and things like that, like there's times where I close it and I say like, no, like this is done. This is not a thing right now. And so, but I couldn't stop it. And I was like dizzy. It's right now it's open because we're talking. The top of my head was like burning hot. And it was really uncomfortable. And so that was one of the things that happened and I couldn't turn it off. And I was talking to my friend and he explained it as like filling up a teacup. And it's like, it was me getting filled up with all of that energy. And it wasn't necessarily like messages. It was just the energy of establishing that connection. And I think what kind of happened was it built up and it built up and it built up. And eventually like the floodgate had to open. And then my third eye started being more active because it was like the energy was pushing downward. And we always think about going up, but like, what about pulling the energy in, right? Like pulling towards like my solar plexus, which also needed a lot of work. And so that was kind of how that happened. And then I remember going into someone's records and just getting images. And I was like, whoa, like what is happening? Because I'd never had images before, at least not recently, and like intentionally. So that was kind of one of those. And I think just like, I mean, I was really tired. I was really tired because it's a big change in your energy. Yeah. So it's not so much physical, but just like the fatigue around this is real. I have been going through a lot of health stuff. So a couple months ago, I had a relapse with my MS, and that resulted in stemming, which is like from my feet, it gradually moved up my legs to like my hips and my torso. I went topically numb. And I think there's a couple reasons that happened. I mean, one, I have MS. So like there's definitely like just the biological aspect of that is science fully. I mean, I've been under a lot of stress. So like MS, any autoimmune is triggered by stress, exacerbated by stress. I also think in a sense it needed to happen and I needed to heal through it to show me that like I can be okay. Because actually my reading with Lorena, something that came through, and she was like, I don't understand how MS works. So tell me if this makes sense. But the feeling I'm getting is that you can just be okay. Like you could be in remission forever. And I feel like I had that and I was like, oh, okay, great. And then I had a relapse and I was like, oh, fuck. But what about this thing that was said? But I think it was kind of about me realizing that like I could have this relapse and still be okay. So yeah, there's a couple things like that have also happened. But then the spirit I was working with told me what to do about the relapse, and I did it, and it got better in 3 days. So
I mean, it's so interesting because you're like, stress can bring on something like that.
Yeah.
Any breaking point with stress, and you could be like, oh my God, I need to stop working so much or whatever, right? Like I need to just like, it's a signal for another thing. And in this case, which you're like, that's the science side of it, right? You lessen this, you're going to be better off this way. The spiritual side of it is like, and where there's an intersection is like, you're like, well, what's going on? Oh, cool. Like I can actually control this.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Right. So but that's like a very different, it's a different answer, or maybe it's a similar answer, but different method in getting there. Or different approach to getting there. Lessen your stress, you're going to feel better. Cool, I got that. Thank you, science. Yeah. And then your guides say something that you will have a similar result, but a different approach.
Yeah, and in this case, the message just was breath work, frankincense oil twice a day, and something else. And so I did, and I took like 3 days off messages to just focus on myself. And I did a specific breath work every day that was for immune stuff. And the relapse completely reversed in 3 days. And I remember talking to my neurologist after the fact, and she was even blown away. She's like, that's really fast for it to clear up. Like she was baffled. I was like, well,
did you tell her what you did or no?
I told her that I tapped into like some more like spiritual healing stuff. Like I did tell her like the breath work and the whatever, but in terms of a doctor standpoint, at least most of the time, that's going to just be like stress management. Like it's not connected. I didn't say like a spirit at the park told me to breathe, so I did this, like, you know. But a really cool thing was after that, I went and got acupuncture done. And there was a spot in my trap that when I'd been doing the breath work was getting really hot, and it wasn't releasing. It's just heat was building there, and it was really uncomfortable. And I'm like, what is happening? So then he did the acupuncture, and that spot got hot, and the pain lingered for like 3 days. And so I told him, I was like, yeah, so that's the same spot that when I was doing the breath work, it was like, whatever. And he was like, oh, well, that's linked to this part of your body. And so then I was talking to my friend Neil, who's on another one of these episodes. And he was like, oh, well, what emotion is that linked to? So then I look it up, and it's linked to anger and joy. And a big thing I've been recognizing over the past couple of years is that I don't let myself feel anger, and I am working on it. And interesting, I just bought a plant and it says joy on it. And so it all really connected. And I think that that's a really, acupuncture is a prime example of that, where like spiritual stuff really connects to like physical body.
For sure.
And like even my first couple times in my records after Vivian went away, a message they gave was like, you have all the answers. Your physical body is the map to interpret the spiritual. So like listen to what it is telling you.
That map coming back up.
Oh yeah. The map is there. And I think that brings up another important point is like so many of us on this spiritual path, I see it happening all the time. We discount the physical. We're like, oh, the physical is so limiting. The physical, but it's like, no, the physical is necessary. You are incarnated for a reason. Use it, right? It is here to tell us, like that heat, right? Like the vibrations, like the chills, like the whatever. Read the map, bitch. Like that's how I see it. So
it's the paying attention of a thing, right? Like, and again, that is just like paying attention to any little message that you may receive and having trust in that thing. You know what I mean? Like you could be like, oh my God, my head is bothering me. But it's like, should I go to the doctor or should I not go to the doctor? Or should I like focus on this thing that's happening to me or not?
Yeah. And I think like my friend Taylor said, menial over magic. Like I don't think all of these things need to always have some greater reason or some greater whatever. Like if the light flickers in your house, check the electrical system first. Don't automatically think you have a poltergeist. But also don't discount the things that you can't just explain away. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. How did you first realize it was not you talking? And when did you realize what you were actually doing?
Yeah, I think you actually mentioned that because you mentioned having doubt around that.
Yes.
I feel like mine kind of went backwards. So it does come through in a different voice. And the perspective is different. Like I talk to myself all the time. Like I live alone with a cat. So when I talk to myself, even if it's in my head, it's in my head. And for me, when these other, even when I heard the static, it was here. It was outside of me. Not on this plane, but it wasn't within me. And I think that was part of it. I think the other thing is when it came through as words, which not everyone gets words. So like understood that might not work for you, but it was in a you voice. It wasn't I this and I that. It was you this and this and this. And some of the things just weren't me. Like if you pay attention to syntax, I think that's really important. My one friend, I was channeling for her one day. I went into her records and I was doubting myself a bit because it was in person and I don't really do in person. And like sometimes I take more time and this was just like a quick 10-minute thing. Her fucking guides started rhyming. They were talking to me in like iambic pentameter. Like they gave me like this little song and I was like, really? Really? So I was like, that's not me, you know? So paying attention to things like that. I think the other thing though, for me, it was about just trusting, even if it was intuition and not them, that in that space, I was getting the information I needed to. And like over time, it kind of built up, right? So like either way, I'm carving out this intentional time, whether it's meditation and it's my intuition or it's this. And I think it becomes clearer as you go. And especially, and I think that's why like in our class, you'll remember, they talked about setting like a very strict framework for how you enter your records. So like always use the same candle, use the same sense, same routine, same meditation. Because I think as you build up that container, the contents of it become more well-defined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was like, I knew it wasn't me because of the physical written word. I was noting what I was hearing. That's very different. The words that were chosen, even I would say my handwriting looked a little wacky. It was just like, this is not how I speak. This is not the word I would have chosen, or even the way to like visualize something. Like, this is what this means. Like it would come through in a way that I'd be like, okay, what? Like now I gotta figure out what this puzzle is.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I think that happens for me more. And that's the other thing that my friend mentioned too, is like almost my connection within my records became more well-defined when I did start doing a bit for other people, because you see the differences in how the information comes through. But it's kind of funny. I think it's one of those like practice makes progress, and like trusting, even if it's not them, that what I need is coming. And then eventually it became more clear. I was about to see if I have like a good example. Yeah. So like I went in the other day to ask about something that's coming up for me right now. And it's like how I feel with people being around their families, because I get really uncomfortable when I see people engaging with families, and like specifically whenever I'm in like a romantic partnership and that person's close with their family, I find it really difficult to be around that. At a certain point, I always get what I thought, at least, was jealous of it. I was like, no, like don't, whatever. And so I went into my records to ask about that because I have a trip coming up, COVID safe, don't worry, people. And there's going to be some of that kind of interaction. And I was like, I don't want this to go poorly because of these past things, right?
Yeah.
So the message that came through, and this is the thing, it's like, it's not something I was thinking, but I can read it if you're curious. So it said, like, you are afraid. You are afraid to be part of something, to be loved, because it is not what you know. It's okay to be afraid, to be unsure. It's also okay to want it. You are not forsaking your family by becoming part of someone else's. It reminds you of everything you never had and always wanted, and so you resent it. So that's the thing. I was thinking that I was jealous, and it's like, no. You resent it. And then the words came up. It's not jealousy. It's anger and deep sadness. It's a mirror you do not yet want to look in, but you have to. On this trip, to have the trip you want, you have to look. Open your eyes and your heart to the love. Experience it, hold space for it, honor it, want it for someone else. It is okay. No one should have to choose between love. It is all. It is all. And like, I don't say it is all when I'm talking to people. Like, the fuck is that, you know? So like, and like that, I mean, that's pretty obvious to me that I was channeling, but also because of practicing. But I think the more the more I began to just trust the words as they came out and let them come onto the paper, or however it works for someone else, in the way that they were coming through, and like, don't filter it, it'll become more clear whether it's you or something else. If that makes sense.
What's even crazier is that I felt like you read that in a different voice. I felt like it sounded different. And maybe when you like watch this or like, you know, listen to it, you're like, oh, it's you, but it was just softer, slower. It was different. It was different.
Yeah, you know, and I read it to the person who I'm going with the other day, because we were on the phone talking about this, and I was like, yeah, actually this came up, and I read it because I was like, open conversations are important. I didn't explicitly state that I had been in my records and I had channeled something. I was just like, oh yeah, I was reflecting on this. This is what came up. Because for me, this is what came up always means that I'm channeling something. And they're like, wait, did you write this down? And I was like, oh yeah, it's this. Because they could tell that same thing. Like, they could tell it sounded different. Yeah, so that's interesting that you point that out. But I think it's like kind of, it pulls me back into the state of when it was coming up. And maybe that's that feeling of like that ego and that like defense stepping back to let truth come through.
It felt very calming and peaceful, to be honest. Like, I was like, if I were receiving that message, I'd be like, like, what a relief. And then also where it said it was anger made me think about what you just said about your trap. I was like, man, everything is connected. Pay attention.
It is. And the anger thing, like, I've talked about this before, but it's like anger, and like, it kind of relates to you saying, like, when I said, like, we're not meant to be harmed. Like, I don't think that's the thing we come here to have happen, like, explicitly. And people, like, I had it asked to me before, like, about God and believing in God, and God being something that was said to me is God is everything or else he is nothing, and take the he as like a whatever. It's just how I talk about it. And when I think about anger, and I had always kind of wanted to say, how do I feel angry towards someone or something and still be living in God's self? And a realization I had recently, and I don't think it's like a novel concept, it's been said before, but the thing I heard that really clicked was that, like, anger is what we experience as like God's way of telling us we deserve better. And so allowing myself to feel anger, that's not separate from God. That's getting closer to my essence and my truth and my worth and my God self. What I do with that anger might be a different story, but like feeling it and acknowledging it and understanding it's warranted, like, that's not separate from.
Yeah.
And that was really important for me to start to actually tap into that a bit.
Amazing. I love that. Because it's true. And I think it goes to like self-judgment and also to the control of your reactions to things. You should feel it, and then it's up to you with what you do with it. But at least allow yourself to feel it. It's okay to feel anyway.
Yeah.
This is awesome. I feel like so many things have come up. I can't even believe it's 3 hours later.
I know. Are there any other questions that are standing out or that you have?
Let me see. I actually think we hit off on all of them.
You're a good interviewer, my friend.
Let's see. Yeah, and I probably think there'll probably be more parts of this that'll come up for you. Conversations, extensions, all of that other stuff.
Always, yeah.
That's gonna come.
Well, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you being open to kind of facilitating this, because it's like, yeah, I could have come on here and just talked about it all, but I feel like the same, like obviously the same stuff wouldn't have come up. And I always find talking about myself on my own to be kind of jarring. So yeah, I really appreciate you being open to it and like the questions you did ask and just like you holding that space.
For sure. And it was very actually like healing, cathartic to me. Like a lot of the themes that came up, protection, like all that stuff. I was just like, man, so interesting. This is what you need to listen to. Or so yeah, it just furthers the connection. So happy to do it any other time, anytime. Call me. I'm here. Fantastic.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of Coffee Time. Before you leave, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And if today's show resonated, I invite you to drop into the comment section and share whatever personal introspection came up for you today. Anything you can do to help make the show more accessible is super duper appreciated. Until next time, I am your host and coffee drinking companion, Natalie, wishing you a beautifully caffeinated day.